and welcome to the Sunshine Cathedral. The Sunshine Cathedral is a different kind of church where the past is past and the future has infinite possibilities. And with that, we invite you to come and worship with us here on Sunday mornings at 9 and 10:30 a.m. at 1480 Southwest 9th Avenue. Now, I invite you to come in and worship with us here at the Sunshine Cathedral.
Our first reading is a reading from Wisdom of Gerald G. Jampolsky. When my very foundation seems to have disappeared, when my future seems to be in terrible doubt and the world seems very unfair, when it feels that it is no longer safe to trust and that there is a temptation to blame someone else for the predicament I am in, when I feel fragmented as if I were a jigsaw puzzle, when it feels as if God has lost my file and has abandoned me, and that all my previous faith was wrongly placed, and that I will never be able to trust or have faith in others or God again, when I have forgotten that the essence of my being is love, I can be absolutely sure of one thing. It is not that God has abandoned me, but that I have abandoned God, and I can choose again. In these human words, God's voice is heard.
Our second reading is from the wisdom of the Torah. From the wilderness, the whole congregation of the Israelites journeyed by stages, as the unnameable mystery commanded. They camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. The people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test providence?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried out to the source of life, "What shall I do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." The divine said to Moses, "Go on ahead of the people and take some of the elders of Israel with you. Take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile and go. I will be standing there in front of you on the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock and water will come out of it so that the people may drink." Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, whose people wondered, "Is God among us or not?" In these human words, God's voice is heard.
I have a real resonance with these readings today, with psychologist Dr. Jampolsky saying, God has not abandoned me. if I feel all these things, if I feel all these pressures, if I feel all these stresses, if I feel all this angst, it's not that God has abandoned me, but I have abandoned God, and I can choose again. Now, I happen to know that there are those of us who are from a part of the world called the Bible Belt that will hear that in a different way than Dr. Jampolsky intends. Dr. Jampolsky is saying that we may experience, we may feel as if God is not available to us, but that is our feeling, that is not the reality, and we can change how we feel by choosing different thoughts. That if we will learn to think, if we will change our habitual thinking, we will change our whole mindset, which changes our attitude, which changes how we experience life. So if I feel that God is not around, that's not about God, that's about me, and I can always work on me. So that's what he's saying, and that's what I agree with. But there is a sect in the part of the world that I grew up in, and they were called the Free Will Baptist. Now, that's not to be confused with the National Baptist and the Missionary Baptist and the Southern Baptist and the American Baptist and the Seventh-day Baptist and the Full Gospel Baptist, and there were like 50,000 kinds of Baptists. There was also the Free Will Baptist. And the Free Will Baptist, their thing is that you have the freedom. You can choose. You have the free will to choose to reject your own salvation. So even after you've been saved, you can give it up. No one ever explained to me why that would be attractive to anyone, but still, that you have the free will to give it up. And so some of us, when we hear, I have abandoned God, we hear that. And that, I just want to make it clear that is not what Dr. Jampolsky is saying. That isn't the message that you'll be hearing here at the Sunshine Cathedral. But the question we hear at the end of that reading from Exodus 17, is God among us or not? Now, don't raise your hand. I'm not going to out you. But just within yourself, how many of us have asked that question? Is God hearing my prayers? Is God aware of my condition? Does God care what I'm going through? And why is it that we would ever ask that question? To ask that question means that we must have believed at some point that God was not available to us, or that it was possible for God to not be available to us. And maybe that is because people told us that was the case. And maybe they didn't mean to, but that was the message they were communicating. How many times have we seen people, even in churches, hear people talk about God, and when they talk about God, they point up like Santa with the reindeers on the rooftop. Up on the rooftop, there God is, or whatever. There's a pointing up, as if... Well, that may be pretty close, but there's still some distance. And so, and we will learn to pray that way. We would pray, God, we invoke your presence. We invite your presence. Where what was it before we started talking? And if God wasn't around, how did God hear us call on God? You know, if we're not raising our voice, ooh, God, how did God hear us? And we just said, God, we call upon you. Well, where was God to begin with, right? Or we will say, God, we come to you. Well, where were we before we came to God? So we had all of these subconscious messages that God was somewhere else. And not only was God looking at us from a distance, God wasn't terribly impressed with what God was looking at. And so after we said, oh God, we come to you and we praise you and we thank you and we bless you and we grovel and we're kissing your foot and we're hoping so hard that you'll pay attention to us and be nice to us and pat us on the head, we would then launch into, and I am so sorry for all the ways I've offended you. What did I do? Well, you know, how bad could I have ever been? And so we were taught that God was at a distance. And from God's bird's eye view, God was looking down, sideways, across, wherever that distance was, and not being terribly impressed with what God was seeing. And so, of course, we come to the question, is God among us or not? Is God with me or not? Does God care or not? And I don't think we can be healed from the pain that causes the question until we have the courage to ask the question. And so we see the Israelites. Yes, they're grumbling. Yes, they're complaining. Yes, they're stuck in some negative thinking, but they are also courageous to dare to say, okay, what's true? What is true? Now, they're asking it out of their pain. Oh, nothing's going right. Nothing's going the way we wanted it to go. And so, are we, if things are difficult, does that mean God isn't present with us? But even if the question came out of some strange and hurting place, it was an honest question. And until it is honestly and fearlessly asked, a satisfying answer will never be found. Meister Eckhart said, God is at home, it's we who have gone for a walk. And that's what Dr. Jampolsky is saying. And that is what the writer of this story in Exodus wants us to get to. That yes, we will feel sometimes as if God is somehow not with us. And that is our opportunity to work through that within ourselves, to remember that God is omnipresent, which means God cannot be somewhere far away. God is everywhere. So wherever I am, God is. God is with me in the pain. God is with me in the confusion. God is with me in the fear. God is with me all the time. We feel abandoned. And I think that is because we not only we've heard language that makes God sound as if God would abandon us, but we have personally experienced abandonment in our lives. And so we project those feelings onto the greatest power we can imagine. And so having never felt safe in our own skins, in our own communities, in our own world, how can we feel safe with God? And so our issue is to ask the question, is God among us or not? And then to get to the place where we say, God can't go anywhere. So if I'm not experiencing a sense of peace, a sense of presence, I must have somehow mentally checked out. I've gone for a walk, and I can change my habits of thinking. I can change my attitude. I can change my beliefs. Beliefs are just well-rehearsed opinions. Opinions are just thoughts that have become habitual. And I am the thinker that thinks the thought that makes the thing. So once I choose a new thought, and then I keep thinking it until it becomes a habit. And then I keep thinking it habitually until it becomes an opinion. And I keep holding that opinion until it becomes a belief. Once I'm in charge of that process. It's how I got to where I am. If I believe that God is against me, judging me, if I believe that in the ocean of life, God is a shark, I heard that till I said it till I owned it till it was my experience. But the key element in all of that is me. I can choose a new thought. And I can practice that new thought until I have a new belief, and I can hold that belief until I have a new experience. To change our perception may be a process, but we can do it. And once we change how we see a thing, we change how we experience a thing. If our default position is to believe that God is punishing or judgmental or generally disappointed with our very existence, we can learn to see all of that differently. We can entertain different ideas, affirm different possibilities, and rehearse new ways of exploring meaning in life. Just as we decided to believe at some point that God was chronically displeased with us. Now, first of all, think about that. That we came to believe that God was chronically displeased with us, and because it was presented to us in a formational stage, and we were so overwhelmed by it. It was so in the atmosphere of our homes and in the workplace, in the community, in the worship setting. It became so normative. It seemed so natural. When any other relationship, if there was someone who was just always looking to find fault with you, you wouldn't have anything to do with that person for very long. The person who is out to get you, the person who can never be pleased by you, the person who will never approve of you, the person who finds something wrong with you all of the time, this person you do not invite into your home for dinner, much less into your heart to stay. And somehow we allowed God to be presented as this really obnoxious personality. And then we wanted to please that personality that had so much difficulty being pleased. And so if we took on that God, we can also take on a different understanding, a different experience. We can choose to believe that God is everywhere fully present, and we must be part of that presence, unable to ever be separate from it. We are in it, we are of it, we are filled with its light, and we can see a new concept, this new concept of the divine, and find that new concept to be sublime. There came a time in my life when I simply decided that God must be a gracious presence within which all life exists and that we can never be apart from God. I just got tired of begging God to have mercy. I just got tired of asking God to forgive me for having thoughts and feelings and questions, for being who I am. I just got tired of always being afraid that I wouldn't be good enough. I just got tired of being afraid that maybe I wouldn't make it into the next realm of this never being able to please deity. And I got tired of being afraid that loved ones might have been rejected. It just became so burdensome and overwhelming, I had to make the decision to let it go. I had to be, as you'll read in my book, I had to be saved from salvation. I had to let it go because it was making me miserable. And I just had to decide that God had to be better than that to be my God. I remember, and I've told this story so many times in this pulpit, and I will tell it many, many more. The day, I was about 19, that I came out to my grandmother. I'd never done it before then because I was afraid, she was never a well woman, and I was afraid it would just push her over the edge. And my therapist told me there was not a case on record of anyone dropping dead upon hearing the news that someone was gay, and that I could risk it. And so I came out to her and gave her some literature to read in case she wanted to learn something about it. I'm gay, here's P-flag, good night. And she woke me up the next morning way earlier than I ever would rise on my own because she couldn't wait anymore. Just to say, if I've ever said anything that hurt you, I am so sorry. I decided in that moment that if God was not as good as my grandmother, I didn't need God, I just needed her. And the minute that I decided that God had to be as unconditionally loving, accepting, embracing as my grandmother, the minute I decided that is when I started to experience God in just that way. God had never been judging me. God had never been out to get me. God had never abandoned me. I had simply not allowed myself to experience the omnipresence, the goodness that God is, the goodness that will not let me go. And the minute I just decided that I was willing to do it, I started having that experience more and more. And I will never settle for any other kind now. I decided that this had to be, divine love had to be all-inclusive and unconditional, or otherwise it wasn't worth my time. That to get into that God's heaven wouldn't be heavenly for me. It would just be one more oppressive system for me to navigate in another world, and I just wasn't interested. And then the questions would come, but what if you're wrong? And so I had to work through that. I had to ask the question and deal with it and wrestle with it. And I decided that I would rather be wrong to believe that God is truly love than to be right about God being a monster. And so I just couldn't believe that God would abandon God's people for any reason, that God would never let go of us, not because of who we love, not because of what we believe, not because of what we couldn't believe, not because of where we were or who we were, that the love that God is, the omnipresent love, could not let us go. And the minute I chose to believe it, I let myself believe it, and the minute I believed it, I started experiencing it, and life has never been the same. I would never serve a God that would abandon me for using my mind, for being honest about my love, or even for asking sincere questions or giving voice to heartfelt doubts. God had to be better to be my God. And as I allowed God to be better, my experience of God and of life got exponentially better. I challenge you today, I beg you today, to let your concept of God be good, truly good, outrageously good. As good as you can imagine it. It's not as good as it can get. Just let yourself put down all the boundaries, and you will experience more good in the depths of your own being. That sense of unlimited good dwelling in your own spirit can lead you forward to your own land of promise. When Moses' people were enslaved in Egypt, they wanted a better life, but they couldn't remember what a better life might look like. And so Moses leads them. He casts a vision and he leads them, and they buy it for a minute, and they leave Egypt, and they steal everything they can get their hands on except a map or a compass, and so they wind up lost for a long time. But they grab the silver, and they grab some stuff they need, some cattle, And they go out into the wilderness. They hadn't considered that this journey might involve sacrifice, and it might involve uncertainty along the way. And they didn't yet realize how important the vision that had been cast really was, because it's in times of uncertainty that the vision of better days will propel us forward. It was a vision that would lead them to a land of promise, and the vision would sustain them until they found their way to the better experience. The journey from Egypt to the promised land is still a journey with setbacks and detours, but the vision can sustain us on the journey. And even when the journey is difficult, that is still the way we get to the divine promise. We aren't being led to the problems, we are being led through the problems to the promise. The vision is actually life-giving in the time of travail, and the vision is something to cling to when there is nothing else. The prophet Habakkuk said, "If the vision seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place." Its delay is not its denial. Don't give up on the vision. Keep holding the vision. There may be times that the vision is all you have. For God's sake, don't let it go. The vision of what can be, of what we have pledged to see to fruition, is what brings us hope and joy during the uncertain and difficult times. On the journey to the land of promise, the people forgot what they had achieved so far. They forgot what the vision of what could be looked like. They forgot why they had taken all the risks to begin with. And when they forgot, they lost their purpose until they chose to remember again, until they chose to look at things in a new way, until they chose to experience some sense of renewal and start over and keep moving forward. They had fallen into that trap that oppressed people fall into called horizontal violence. They took their pain and frustration and disappointment out on their leaders and on their movement and even on one another. And by staying divided and feeling helpless and victimized and unworthy, they remained victimized by their oppressors, even though they had left the land of oppression. But leaving Egypt isn't enough if you bring Egypt with you. Stop calling yourself a recovering anything. You left that place. You are at the Sunshine Cathedral. Own it. Be it. Stop saying you're a former this or Stop saying, I am Anglican or Catholic or Mormon, unless you are, if you're a visitor, welcome. But if this is your home, let it be your home. And we're not where we're going to be yet, but we have a vision, and we are going to keep moving forward. It is just not good enough to go back. It is just not good enough to go back. When you leave the job, when you leave the relationship, when you leave the religious environment that told you were worthless, leave that message behind also. What they did when we were in bondage to them, that's on them. But let us not be agents of our own oppression. Let's not take their message with us as we move into better possibilities. Let us have the courage not only to leave the environment, but to leave the lies behind. Someone said just this week to me, a heterosexual person, that they had just decided they had to love their gay child. That they had wrestled with all of their fundamentalism, and in the end, their love for their child just won out, and their religious community turned on them viciously. And I just said, I would have no use for that community. You have done what God would do. You have put love ahead of tradition and prejudices. I just would have no time for people that said you had done something wrong by loving your child unconditionally. What is the Egypt you have left? Maybe it's an old theology. Maybe it's an old prejudice. Maybe it's an old fear. What is the Egypt you have left but still carry some of with you, so that you're not totally free of its harsh lash just yet? In moments of uncertainty, do you miss the land of oppression? Do you long for the good old days that weren't that good at all? Or do you dare to say, the best is yet to be, and I deserve all the good that is possible? I won't turn back, but will continue moving forward toward the possibilities. The gods of Egypt were symbols of oppression,